Okay, good morning and welcome to this latest webinar in Quantima's Building Financial Fortitude series. My name is James Ashton. I'm a financial journalist and author. I'll be your chair for this morning's budget discussion. On Wednesday, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak talked about difficulties facing the UK economy, but also what he saw as possibilities. So let's see over the next hour if our expert panel agrees with him. There was, of course, an extra £65 billion of COVID-19 support this year and next, including the ongoing furlough scheme and reliefs in business rates, stamp duty and VAT. But there was a sting in the tail from the hike to 25% for corporation tax. For many of the same firms, the Chancellor hopes will pour an extra £20 billion into business investment thanks to his tax super deduction. And the very large borrowing figures acted as a reminder that Sunak and successors may need to find more ways to balance the books going forward. A reminder, Building Financial Fortitude from Quantima is aimed at advisors and businesses alike. Please take a look at quantima.com/fortitude for articles, videos and details of events like this one that provide practical insights to tackle what's going on in the economy right now and how directors can go from crisis management to looking at the longer term strategy. Please send in your questions to the Q&A function and I'll try to get through as many of them as possible before 10:30. So I should introduce the panel. They're the ones answering the questions this morning. We're very pleased to have with us, first of all, Professor Trevor Williams. He was formerly Lloyds Banking Group's chief economist, and now he's visiting professor at the University of Derby and rotating chairman of the Institute of Economic Affairs Shadow Monetary Policy Committee. Also, Jimmy McLaughlin is here as well, backed by popular demand. Jimmy was for several years business advisor in Downing Street to the Boris Johnson and Theresa May administrations. Now he's a commentator, contributor to the Times, and he has his own podcast, Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. From Quantima, Louise Durkin is a managing director and head of Quantima's financial advisory team. She's got bags of experience in distress situations, turnarounds, and with some focus on helping clients of all sizes with performance improvement and working capital management. And completing the panel, Ian Barton is a managing director in Quantima's corporate finance team. Over 20 years, he's focused on advising shareholders on merger and acquisition, sourcing funding and planning shareholder restructuring, and has specialist experience in logistics, software and private equity. Welcome to all four of you. Trevor, let me start with you. I'm conscious of the questions we've had in for this session ahead of time already. So much on borrowing, and to wrap that, I'm really interested in your view of the macro level and these really big numbers that Rishi Sunak came out with on Wednesday. One question is, how long will it take the UK government to get the debt position back to pre-COVID levels? What defines a sensible debt level? Can we inflate our way out of the debt? Over to you. You're on mute. Still can't hear you, Trevor.
So
there you go.
Thank you very much indeed for the questions. I think they're fantastic questions to kick off a session like this. And that is clearly a focus of attention because it's risen so much. I'd just like to make a few comments about it in order to be able to answer those questions, if I may. So when will it stabilize? Well, we don't have a target. So there's no legislated fiscal rules in place, which they used to be in the past. There isn't a fiscal mandate to get structural deficit below X% of GDP, for example, which used to be the case previously. There isn't a fiscal objective or a balanced budget rule, which has been put in place, for example. But there is a supplementary target, which is that debt falls as a percentage of GDP. To that extent, on the forecasts, this does begin to happen in 2 or 3 years' time. And that's because of the tax increases that are built in effectively to kick in 22, 23. And of course, the freezing of the allowances, which effectively will be a real-time tax increase as of next year when they don't start to adjust in line with whatever the rate of inflation is. So the overall deficit, one of the questions that was asked was, when will it get back to pre-COVID levels? Answer, it won't. Because I'll make 2 points about that. Before the 2007-8 crisis, UK debt was running at 35% of GDP. After that crisis, it jumped to about 80% of GDP. Post-COVID, it's jumped to about 110% of GDP. Please ignore the 97%, which keeps being talked about in the government's numbers. If you look at the stats, they've excluded Bank of England debt, and you really can't exclude it because QE is so key to keeping down long-term interest rates. Because it's effectively buying up the debt which the government has issued, which is one reason why stock markets and asset prices are so buoyant around the world, because quantitative easing by central banks is really finding its way into financial markets. It's not going into lending by companies for investment or for hiring or for expansion plans. It's really at the moment mainly going into the financial market. So debt won't come back down to 80%. It'd be a gargantuan task to expect that to happen. The second implied question is, what happens when interest rates rise? Well, debt interest payments will rise. And so that becomes a major issue, given that outstanding debt is so high. The legacy costs of paying for that with future interest rate rises will be a significant risk. So keeping inflation low is actually quite key. I don't think we will get inflation, by the way, for a number of reasons, not least the fact that we're in a globalized world where markets are still open, and the effects of low prices in the rest of the world impacts the UK, but also the fact that technology is now reducing the price of a whole bunch of goods and services, makes them more affordable for more people, so it helps to keep down price inflation, as well as the fact that inflation expectations are low. Underlying all of that, I think, though, is the fact that we have very low productivity in the UK. So over the last decade, productivity has actually been pretty flat. In other words, this explains why pay levels are so low. The real way to get debt down is to actually grow the economy. To grow the economy, we have to focus on productivity. And there's not enough about productivity in the budget. That's a quick answer.
Yeah, no, I'll come on to, thanks for that, Trevor. That's a great oversight. And I'll come back, we'll come back, I think, to productivity later on. I'm interested, the flip side from borrowing would be your view on the growth outlook. I mean, 4% growth this year. It does seem that of the major developed economies, the UK is a little bit slower out of the traps than some of the others this year, despite this wonderful vaccination program we're having. 7% next year looks good, and then actually it drops back to trend. And to trend actually is, or I always remember things used to begin with a 2 when you went back to trend. But now trend is 1.6, 1.7%. So what's your view on the growth? This didn't seem sensational stuff from the OBR.
Yeah, well, it comes back partly to productivity, but let me take your comments from the way you asked them, which is overall growth. 4% this year is not great in terms of the G7 economies or other major advanced economies. We're about 2 percentage points below them on average. Partly that's because we shut down aggressively in back end of last year. We were late into shutdown, actually, and we opened too early last year as well. So we had a pretty draconian shutdown. And so our Q1 GDP is likely to show a fall of around 4% or so. So we're off the blocks at a lower pace than the others, effectively. I'm not so sure that we will grow by 7% next year, I have to say. I think that's a tall order. But our growth rate on average over the 2 years is pretty much going to be the same as the others. But we grow structurally more slowly because we have lower productivity. Our productivity level is the lowest of the G7 economies and has been for about a decade. Productivity is one aspect of growth. So growth is actually driven by the way you do things, how smart you do it, and the labor force that you throw at it. And this is where Brexit comes in too. So the point about growth in the period beyond 22-23, that it goes back to the trend of around about 1.5% or so, is partly because we're going to have slower growth in our labor force, partly because we've shut off some aspects of immigration that our economy requires. So one of the things people may not know is that we have a shortage of nurses, 40, 50,000 shortage of nurses. We've got a shortage of doctors, right? Where do they come from? We don't train them enough here. It takes many years to be able to do that and lots of money. So, and there was no mention about those sorts of things, it seems to me, which are so critical to get the trend growth rate up. So to get debt down, we need to improve the trend growth rate. To do that, we need to get productivity growing. There's little we can do about growth in the labor force, other than immigration, which we've cut off some of that. So I think the trend growth rate it's about right. I actually think it's a little bit fast, it seems to me. And so where's the Brexit effect in this? Well, the Brexit effect will come through in the trend growth rate. And I suspect that partly why our growth rate, even at the end of 25, 26, is still not 3% below where it otherwise would be, is not a post-COVID effect. I think it's a post-Brexit effect.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah. Thank you, Trevor. Come to Jimmy now. I'm very interested in the political angle on the budget, Jimmy. I guess if Trevor was the government's electorate, then the message is must do better. But I'm interested in what you can do in such unprecedented times. And I suppose to what degree Sunak has got the business community behind him with that whacking corporation tax increase.
Yeah, I think that's right, James, and it's fascinating to listen to Trevor's opinions on this and talking through the economics of it, because so much of it is incomprehensible to people, even well informed. The numbers that we are discussing are quite difficult to get your head around at times. I think the business community is broadly behind. The business community is broadly behind the budget so far. Part of what they are supportive of is the signalling that's been given, and big business's problem, particularly for the last few years, has been the lack of certainty that the government has provided around Brexit and so on. And it's been quite a difficult time if you are a FTSE chief executive. Remember that a FTSE chief executive is in place for on average 4 to 5 years. So if you've taken the job since 2015, you've largely had a huge amount of uncertainty and big changes to deal with from the UK side of things.
I always feel very sorry for them, Jimmy. They have such a difficult time.
I know, you and me, James, as well. Perhaps we should create a club for the two of us. So I think big business is broadly on side with it. I worry about the sort of the entrepreneurship side of things. You know, you saw the Prime Minister's Business Council appointed the other day, 30 people, almost entirely from big business, and it will be entrepreneurship and innovators that get our way out of this. And I think by the nature of the way that entrepreneurs and small businesses, when they start out, they're not particularly organised with engaging with the government. And I think what has been a Zoom world has made that even more difficult to kind of create that serendipity. So I think big business is broadly supportive of it. I think the public will give the government a lot of slack at the moment in terms of how to kind of deal with this. And you've seen the polls that have come out in the last 48 hours broadly. You know, I mean, some of the best polls I've seen post-budget for government. So I think that the government has a lot more leeway with the public. And actually, when I heard Starmer sort of attacking the government, I just thought, I'm not sure you're quite getting into the public mood, but it's hard for Starmer because, you're leader of the opposition, you have to oppose. And I think that's quite hard to do at the moment.
Yeah, interesting. I'll come on to Louise and Ian shortly, but Trevor, I just wanted to come back to you on, I suppose, there's two things to address. I'm interested in where you think the vision was. This is still nearer the start than the end of this government, probably, unless they do a quick election, around 23, 24, as has been speculated. I wonder if we've yet got that vision. That's that third pillar of the budget was really a bit thin in terms of where the future economy, where the growth comes from. And then on the productivity point, your view on this, the super deduction. This is meant to be about £20 billion boost of business investment. Of course, investment is where productivity comes from. So is that going to stick, do you think?
That's two great questions. I think for vision, you're probably going to have to watch the latest movie about Vision and Wonder, which is science fiction, of course. No, I don't think there was a strategic overview in it. No. I don't think that there was a map about what is the future of the UK. What are we? What are we going to be? What are we trying to achieve? Yeah. What does success look like? Where are we going as a country? How are we going to achieve it? So I think a vision, a strategy, and then the planning. And the budget for me is the planning bit, but you haven't got the other two layers about what does this all mean? So for example, where does care homes fit in? Where does an aging population fit in? How are we going to look after people in a world where competition and global competition, the changing technologies, destroying some of the old traditional jobs? What do we do about people that are trapped in work but are working poor because pay levels have been held down? Does that mean that we should think about a living wage for everybody? And how do we achieve that if we want to? So you need these kind of questions to be posed by government in power, looking over a 5-year horizon. And where the budget fits into that should be part of that. So you're absolutely right, James. I don't see that in this. And that's a lack. Maybe they are transactional. They're looking very much at events, and there isn't a vision in there at all, in my view. Your other point was about to what extent does the
super deduction will it work? Because of course on the super deduction, the headlines we're getting now are this is not about business investment. This is about what's going to look like an easy ride for some of our biggest tech companies.
I don't think that's what they intended to do, to give them some credit, James. I think that they really think that pulling a policy lever will magic up investment and magic up productivity growth. That's not the way it works. So, and this comes back to the point that Jimmy made about what kind of a government is this? Is it a decentralizing, liberalizing government, empowering companies and empowering people to get on and achieve and be successful? That's part of what the vision and the strategy would be, and this is what you don't see. So I don't think this will solve our productivity problem. I think that there is an issue many economists have argued about, where plant and machinery investment should actually be totally tax deductible. Just as current spending is tax deductible. So this should be too. And I think that is an absolute point that may drive permanently. So this may bring forward some investment, but then after it ends, there'll be a dearth of, there'll be barren ground for investment. And then of course the 25% kicks in for companies where profits are over 250,000, which they'll only pass on to their customers anyway. So I don't really see the point that this will have. I'd rather they'd said, right, in future, plant and machinery investment by companies in the UK is going to be tax deductible, and so expensing, I think, would have a permanent boost. Productivity, as I mentioned earlier, is more about how you decentralize, how you liberalize, how you make the economy competitive. So you put in place rules, for example, about 5G, encouraging companies to adopt the next level of technology. And we need to think about how we achieve faster rates of productivity growth, given that we've not achieved any productivity growth in the last 11 years. That's the real challenge we face, James.
Jimmy, just to come back to you very, very much in brief, just to take up Trevor's challenge, what kind of government is this?
Well, look, I think Trevor raises a fair point in terms of what is the strategy and what is the vision. There was obviously a lot of thought that we put into this kind of post-Brexit, but we now live in a post-Brexit, post-COVID world, and that is different. The thing I would say is that every 30 or 40 years in British politics, you get a big shift. You had mass elections take place from 1918, foundation of the Labour Party, 1920s. That was a big change. Welfare state off the back of World War II and Clement Attlee in the 1940s. Thatcher and neoliberalism, enterprise economy in the 70s, 80s. We are undoubtedly at that moment again about what kind of vision that we have. Now, part of it is probably, has been a rejection slightly of globalization or of over globalization. And the world has kind of been in that place. And 2016 was the start of that. Trevor has talked about the previous, it's not a Thatcherite kind of party as much anymore, and I think there is some truth in that of what's being said, because the Conservative Party changes. There's a reason why it's been the most electorally successful party in the world for the last 250 years, is because it can adapt to the times. What those times are, I think genuinely we don't know, because we're not through this and we don't know the long-term scarring effects. So I think it's fair to say, it is a fair point to say, what is this government? What does it stand for? And at the moment, it's not abundantly clear what that long-term vision is, but totally understandable.
We'll keep looking. Louise, let me bring you in on some of the specifics. I mean, they weren't surprising necessarily, but this idea about the ongoing support, the furlough scheme goes on, business rates relief, stamp duty, VAT relief. This is this is good for confidence, isn't it? I mean, there is no cliff edge.
I think that the continuation of that level of support is going to bring some welcome certainty for many businesses. And yeah, you've listed out a range of things that do continue for a period of time, but not forever. I think that's the important thing to remember. But I suppose, you know, what businesses are looking for to bring some additional certainty is probably missing, frankly, from what we've heard so far. We don't know what the government's role is going to be as and when those measures are withdrawn. We don't know what that's going to look like. We don't know what that transition is going to look like. And I think, I mean, it's been mentioned probably more so around my sort of social network and environment rather than maybe others on this call. But the word insolvency is mentioned twice in this budget. And in a context where we're making comparisons to 2019 and how they've managed to keep the insolvency numbers down compared to 2019. Well, you can do that when you've got furlough in place, when all these additional measures are in place. But I suppose the question is, as and when those measures are withdrawn, what does the government do? And what position does it take as a major creditor in many companies at this point in time? And what does it do thereafter? So yes, some level of certainty for some, but an awful lot of unanswered questions, I'd say, still for many.
I'm just shocked that you are you're socialising with insolvency practitioners as well. I mean, that really is.
I know. We're an awful bunch. We like to have a debate as whose glass is half empty and whose is half full.
Yeah.
I'd just like
so on that. Yeah. So on that, Louise, I mean, we don't really know whether any of these measures will help to reduce the levels of company restructurings and insolvencies. Actually, it's just further deferral. That's what you're saying.
Well, we know there already has been deferral. So we know, whilst Richie likes to talk about the numbers of insolvencies being virtually 30, I think it's 27% down on prior year. That's as a consequence of these measures. So we know that there's a backlog sat there. There's a number of businesses that throughout 2020, had what has happened not happened, they would have inevitably failed. So I think the reality is we are going to see some level of business failures as and when some of these measures stop, and it might only take one for an individual business to have an impact. So I think that there is that to come and that there is that to happen, but also I guess it really depends on each business as the condition it was in at the point that the pandemic had a hit on it, whether they were locked down or put into restriction, and how they've managed to survive over the last year, whether they've been thriving, and plenty have, but whether they've literally been using these support systems to delay the inevitable. And we know anecdotally there are a number of businesses that have said to us, well, as long as these measures are in place, we can just about hold on in there, and we will hold on in there. But we are actually planning to place this company into liquidation the moment that furlough comes to an end, because actually the business is fundamentally gone. It's changed so dramatically. So I think in some cases, but there's an inevitability that businesses will fail, unfortunately.
Because a lot of the huge cost of this 65 billion that's talked about, I think, is a very, very expensive job preservation plan that we're no longer going to peak. I think at what it was, 10–11% of jobless, and now it might be, I think, 6.5%. I mean, Trevor, I'm interested in your view. Question from Peter Hollingsworth. He wonders if the unemployment peaking at only 6.5%. As Rishi said on Wednesday, is credible.
I think it is credible if they continue the support schemes. And Louise's point is spot on. And your point, James, it's a job protection scheme. It's to protect the red walls. This is again, the government thinking very short term. Thinking in an electoral cycle. To Jimmy's point, and there's a reason why they keep winning elections and Labour keeps losing. So I think that it may well peak at 6.5. My view is that it's more likely to peak above 7, because I think that the inevitability for companies when these protection schemes expire is that they're going to be left with the debts that they owe government, and the trading revenue won't be able to cover those interest payments, even though actually implicit in some of the debt projections, or rather not implicit but not explicit in it, is a 30 billion write-off of some of the debts which have been incurred by lending to firms. However, so my short answer is the unemployment rate, in my view, is more likely to peak above 7 than below 7, and that there's going to be a cascade of failures once these schemes are withdrawn, and the government will be able to do little about that. And actually, as an economist, we need some of those failures to take place, May seem cruel, but in order to create the jobs of the future, for the successful companies to be able to get assets cheaply and start the cycle of rebuilding once again, we need this to happen. You cannot protect zombie companies. They just suck profitability away from current, more efficient companies and make the economy worse off. Best to get the adjustment cycle over as quickly as we can. And that's one of the purposes of insolvency businesses, to do this recycling of old into new.
Yeah. Ian, let me bring you in. What was there on Wednesday lunchtime for the owner operator, the companies that you know well as they plan to come out of the pandemic?
Well, I think there's a fair amount that was pre-announced. So things like delays on VAT and the extension of furloughs we've talked about. But you know, the main thing that was in there was I guess what we might call SYBILS 2, these recovery loans as they're now badged. So the opportunity for people who've already had SYBILS to come back and get another slice of that between 25 grand and 10 million. So a pretty broad range. Not a lot of detail on that, but one would expect it will look very similar to how SYBILS does. Now, you know, the key with SYBILS is that it was interest free, it was fee free for the first 12 months, and it was repayment free. And we're now about to enter that zone 12 months on from the start of the pandemic, when SYBILS will start incurring interest, will start incurring repayments. And, you know, is SYBILS 2 really just to help repay SYBILS 1? And so we just keep that cycle going round. You know, clearly the government is not going to want that to be the case. You know, they need to get that money repaid. But this recovery scheme is only open until the end of 2021. You know, the question will be, you know, when we're all sat here in 12 months' time, are we going to be talking about SYBILS 3?
I always think it always makes me think of Faulty Towers. I'm sure it doesn't you because you're a professional, but I think it's just a curious name for a loan. Ian, a question in this area from Rich Olson, just really about, and Trevor touched on it as well, just about the amount of debt that is out there now, and the way it's being given out, you know, willy-nilly. I mean, what's the impact on the marketplace? And you know, clearly, so much of it is never going to be paid back. What would the concerns be? You know, and also he touches on fraudulent activity going on. How does it unwind itself, do you think?
Yeah, I suppose you've got businesses. There'll be three buckets really. You will have the fraudulent aspect, and you know that will just be lost. And you know, we saw in Rishi Sunak announced extra money to go and investigate that, but you know, the bounce back loan scheme, which was so easy to take on, inevitably will have been subject to fraud. The second group is sort of those businesses that will, you know, work their way through that debt over a period of time. So perhaps that, you know, they're not you know, they've not been permanently impacted by COVID, and it's a temporary outcome, and they can come back. And we see lots of businesses, you know, in technology and healthcare and logistics and those sorts of areas who have had a reasonably good COVID, really, because they've been in the right areas. And those businesses, you know, will be able to repay those loans. But, you know, there'll be a lot of businesses in that space who will just have too much debt on their balance sheet. And, you know, if they went to a bank to get further investment, I mean, you know, Trevor talked about the super deduction there. You know, for people wanting to invest in physical assets, you know, if they go to the bank and say, I know I've had SYBILS 1 and I've spent all of that, can I have some more money now to go and invest? You know, the bank is going to be looking at those balance sheets and saying, we need some fundamental restructuring here. So there's going to be a new era of equity and debt for equity swaps and fundamental restructuring of balance sheets. And that's just for the businesses that are in decent shape. And then you'll have the businesses that this is all just too much. The weight of the Jimmy, unsustainable.
Thanks, Ian. Jimmy, I'm interested. It's so much depends on the banking sector. It feels like you know, it was the banks that were helped out last time around, and really with this crisis, the banks have to be complicit in supporting the wider economy. I mean, do you think that's where the government sees them operating?
I think that's right. And I think fundamentally, you know, supporting banks and giving banks' positive regulation to work in is not particularly politically popular to do. Try saying that after a couple of gin and tonics, but I think that's why it was interesting that you saw the listings review come out on the same day, actually, because I think that is pretty positive for the city as a whole. That seems to have got support largely across the board there. This is in terms of allowing companies to list much easier and so on. And you saw Deliveroo, very smart public affairs, coming out the day after and sort of saying that they would be listing as a result of it in London.
But yeah, I mean, it feels like they're, I mean, I know they're used to fast deliveries, but there is still a consultation to happen. So this is not set in stone yet.
No, you're right, it's not. But I think I think the direction of travel is pretty clear on. And I think it's largely a positive, and it's an amazing sign. Actually, a company that was founded 6 years ago now potentially going to hit 7 billion valuation just demonstrates that there is positivity out there in terms of it. Now, there's lots of arguments about Deliveroo's business model and so on, but it has led to a lot of innovation and a lot of growth. So I just think it's interesting to look positively. For that. I also think there is this small thing of the tax day in a few weeks' time now, and I think that is going to be really interesting to kind of see what happens there. And I'm speaking to all these entrepreneurs over the last 48 hours who've had this great big and investors and VCs who've all breathed this great big sigh of relief over capital gains tax. And I'm of the opinion of I'm not sure that you're out of the woods yet on this one for another 6 months or another year. I think the tax day will be really interesting to see what comes out. And I know that a lot of kind of tax professionals are thinking that they're going to be a lot busier come March 23rd than they were post-budget.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if the government decided to try and shorten the world's longest tax code, but that might not be the headline that comes out of that day. Ian, obviously you've been talking to a lot of clients about CGT in the last few weeks and month. The question from Chris Newell, CGT was left alone after being widely tipped for an increase. What's your view on it being targeted for an increase in the short to medium term?
Well, I mean, as Jimmy was saying there, those pressures and that political will hasn't changed. It was part of the manifesto in 2019 that they would look at it. They made a change in March 20 to entrepreneurs relief. So it's been signposted that change is coming. When you've got a situation where public sector pay freezes, personal allowance freezes for 5 years, you're not going to do that and then not change capital gains tax. I mean, we completed 8 transactions in the sort of 10 days before the budget. And all of that was really driven by fear of changes to CGT in the budget. I agree with Jimmy. I think the tax day will be an interesting day, either because there will be an announcement then, or there'll be a roadmap set for then. If you look back on Monday, and this is interesting, on Monday, the Treasury Select Committee published their report on post-pandemic reaction of the government. They forecast, I suppose, corporation tax increases, tick, personal allowance freezes, tick, and they were very clear that capital gains tax and IHT, inheritance tax, will change. So whether it happens on the 23rd, whether it happens in an autumn statement, or whether it happens next March, it's coming. I think the likelihood is it's going to be happening sooner rather than later.
Okay, so that's the expectation. Louise, with all of this going on, where are the opportunities for companies that have this thing that we talk about a lot, fortitude? Where is the opportunistics? Where should people be investing, or what sectors do you see as doing well?
We talked a huge amount about fortitude, and that was essentially, battening down the hatches, being strong, looking for opportunity, managing your cash, etc. And there's some things touched upon in there. We've mentioned, yes, there's the recovery loan. The question mark there, as we've already said, is the access to finance is crucial for some businesses. And will that scheme get the money into the right businesses and get credit flow into those that need it the most? And what are they going to use it for? So I found the terminology around recovery loan quite interesting, rather than a survival loan for some people. So there is that. There's also this initiative around restart grants and other opportunities to get funding into that. So those businesses that are in good shape, within the sectors that qualify, by the way, as well, because this is not across the board, they have got some additional support. There's lots of talk of training. So I think for businesses, it's looking to see, you know, what do they need? What have they already started looking at? What changes have they made, and what more changes do they need to make? One of the debates that we've been having is around customer loyalty, for example. Businesses that have been there during lockdown and during restrictions that could remain open, get access to those customers, you know, have people's buying powers shifted and moved around? Have businesses responded to that? Have they seen their competitors picking up market share because they either weren't open, their online function wasn't up to scratch? So I think for those businesses that have taken advantage, moved quickly, moved online, done whatever they've needed to do, we talked a lot about restaurants becoming takeaways and delivery services. So is there more of that to come? And I agree with what Trevor was saying. You know, in part we need that restructuring to happen to give businesses that opportunity to do that. And sometimes that does mean a restructuring. You know, the debt that they've been carrying is you know, that's part of addressing the future and the opportunity as well. We can't just assume in their current form they just add to what they've got to make it better. So there is a combination of things that need to happen, I think.
Yeah, but not going back to how things were before. An interesting question. I know you're not an employment lawyer, Louise, but interesting question from Wayne Bellamy. This idea that if firms have had employees on furlough for a long time, the ability to buy back their standard holiday allowance, is that something that companies are doing or can do? Because I suppose there's all this holiday accruing as well as all the debt accruing. I mean, do you just want to get people back in and get cracking with it, or people aren't necessarily going to want, if you're the CEO, you're not going to want to welcome your staff back and then send them off on holiday for 3 weeks?
Yeah, and many businesses may have done something about that along the way. And yes, you're right. You know, holiday, you still retain your right and accrue your holiday entitlement the time that you're off on furlough. And for many of us that haven't been furloughed, perhaps, you know, we'd quite like a little bit of furlough and holiday combination. I suppose the reality is for businesses that, you know, within what your current structure allows for, you have some flexibility. You also have the ability to ask employees to take holiday even whilst on furlough. They can take those holidays. As an employer, are you going to ask them to do that when they're already sat at home not doing an awful lot for the business? Can you ask them to take holiday? Can they carry it forward? Is there an element of carry forward rather than paying out holiday entitlement? So it's a challenging thing for employers to do in terms of well-being for employees, making sure that you're a fair employer, and it is a balance to be struck. But there's also a commercial reality. Can the business even afford to do that? Themselves? So I think they've got to look very carefully about their policies and what they choose to do, and working within their requirements. But yeah, would an employer turn around and say, well, you've been on furlough for 12 months, you've accrued a year's worth of holiday, I'd like you to take 2 weeks now? Does the children going back to school change that in any way, shape or form? So while you might be on furlough, you have been doing some sort of homeschooling, you've been very, very busy with other things. Does the forthcoming Easter holidays, even though the children have barely even got, well, certainly mine's not back into school on Monday, but would that influence change? So employers need to consult on that and take some decisions around it. It's not an easy one to deal with.
No, it's interesting. Trevor, I want to come back to you. A couple of questions have come in. I want to wrap a few points together. David Watson is asking about what the level of inflation, including house prices, looks like over the next 5 years. And I suppose contributing to that, your view on discretionary spending patterns post-COVID. Michelle Mills wonders if the government is relying too heavily on the fact that people will go back to the way things were, or if we have new spending habits now.
Yes, so reverse first, will there be a roaring 20s? And people go on a hedonistic binge, travel and party like it's not going to end. I suspect that some people can't wait to get out there, and I think that there will be a surge of spending. The savings rate is 17%. I mean, it's going to drop back to about 5% or so. So I think there will be a splurge in discretionary spending. For those in work, prices are low. So, and I think that firms will be offering discounts in the initial phase of reopening. So I think that there will be a huge increase in discretionary consumer spending once the doors are opened and we are allowed out of prison. As Jimmy said, you know, having some time with someone would just be fun. So I think there will be that. On the question, but I think they're not, in so far as they should not be over-reliant on it, they shouldn't be, because as I said, growth is ultimately the result of the combination of productivity and your workforce. If our productivity is low and our workforce is big and growing, we're going to struggle to grow at anything beyond 1.25% or so, or between 1 and 1.5% in the long term. But there will be a burst of spending in the middle of this year, Q2, Q3, and possibly even Q4. I think Q4 we could have a resurgence of virus.
And how much of that is going back to normal? Is it the 2 weeks in Tenerife? Is it the big dinners out, or is it more of that digital spending? I mean, people do say, for example, this is an opportune time for Deliveroo to float, and quite possibly we're not ordering as many takeaways when we can leave the house.
Yeah, well, I think they should float now while the lockdown is going on. I think some of this is overvaluation of many of these companies, but that's a consequence of the lockdown too. But it's also a consequence of something else that we shouldn't forget. It's a consequence of the huge amount of quantitative easing, which has put money in the hands of those who have access to capital. Those who have access to labor, seen a reduction in to labor income, have seen a reduction in their income. And this is the point about what is the contract between government and people here? You know, can you have a set of people that are just doing well and another set of people not doing well? Answer, it's not sustainable in the medium term. So there needs to be another new social contract. The fourth one in the last 100 years, to Jimmy's point, absolutely agree. But to the immediacy of your question, James, about what sort of spending, I think it'd be spending in the shops, spending in restaurants. People are going to travel as much as the restrictions on whether you've had a vaccine or not, and whether or not, you know, you're going to countries with high levels of infectiousness rather, and whether or not you can prove that you are not infected when going to countries with low rates of infection, like New Zealand and like Australia. So I think people are going to travel a lot. That's my view. The safety valve is going to come off. On inflation, I think it's a big question mark. Some think inflation will surge. I don't. I think that we're in a low inflation era for a number of reasons. We still have a global economy. And one of the aspects of this crisis is that many thought that globalization would end. It hasn't. It's booming. Many thought that maybe there would be this issue about globalization, meaning people would want to bring back production on own soil and all that sort of stuff. It hasn't happened because companies can't do it because it's not efficient to do it. And technology enables you to keep down costs and prices. So I think prices will remain low. So to the questioner, I don't think we'll have an inflation problem because we don't live in an inflationary world. And our expectation of inflation is low, and our income is not growing strongly enough for us to continue to spend and live beyond our means. So I think we're in a different era here. So we're in for a period of low inflation as a result of a much more competitive and globalized world, and technology which is driving down the cost of things, and the future growth is in. But it does lead into this question: how do you allow people on low incomes, because their jobs are globalized jobs and they're not niche and specialist, and where they can't extract high value? How do we deal with those people? Answer: we're going to have to find a way of paying them. And I think that this is why the level of government debt is going to remain permanently high. And there's going to be a social contract.
Is it universal basic income? Is that the thing?
Yes, yes. Yeah,
2/3 of Europeans want. You wouldn't expect that from a Tory government, but then there's lots we've seen we haven't expected from a Tory government over the last couple of years.
Well, Tory governments believe in markets. And I think that if this keeps markets going and there's a new social contract, this is part of that debate that should be going on, as well as I said earlier, the debate about, you know, how we fund an aging population in care homes, and we look after the vulnerable in society. There needs to be this debate taking place, and it isn't taking place amongst any of the major parties at the moment.
Yeah, Jimmy, to come to you, one thing that was really loud and clear in the budget, and one thing that wasn't. So the question from Antonio Mercer is: what is your thought on the future of the green industrial revolution? And on the flip side of that, I'm really curious because we're very good at talking about some of these new things down the line, but in terms of adapting what we've already got, I wonder what your view is. Why politically is the business rates review still being kicked down the road? Two of your favourite topics.
One of our favourite topics, James. Yeah. So I think it's interesting on what Trevor was saying about universal basic income and bringing that in potentially, because effectively that is almost what we're trialing at the moment with furlough in a sort of way that we hadn't perhaps intended, and we're trying perhaps up to £2,500 a month for a super version of what UBI is. And I must say that I think, personally, it's not something that I think that we should do. I think that people go to work for far more than just financial reward and a salary. Fine, we wouldn't go to work without it, but there's camaraderie, there's sense of purpose, sense of identity, all of these things. And that's what I think is one of the challenges about whether we, the long-term effects of this, because if people haven't been working for a year or 18 months, even if they've been on furlough and receiving money, it's confidence and things like that that you lose, particularly when we've not been engaging with people as well. So I think it's a really big issue, and look, that's why, to tie it to Antonia's question about the green industrial revolution, it's partly why I launched the podcast Jimmy's Jobs of the Future, was to try and inform people about where these jobs of tomorrow are coming from. Because we often hear politicians talk about we're going to create 250,000 green jobs. And what does that actually mean to people? And I would suggest, if you're going to listen to one episode of the podcast, is the first one with Hayden Wood, who founded the energy company Bulb 5 years ago, now employs 1,000 people, fastest growing company in Europe, according to the Financial Times this week. And out of the 1,000 people he's got there, he reckons only 50 of them were in energy beforehand. And actually, he's employing things like copywriters and marketeers. And you don't need a specific sort of green climate background in those. And that's where I do think it's exciting in terms of what's coming down the track and all these new industries and so on. Just another counterpoint that I want to put to the general themes that I see out there at the moment. It's become very commonplace to say we've seen 5 years worth of change within a year or within a few months. Etc. And I think that is true. I don't just agree with that. But actually, where you get innovation from is when you put lots of different people together and they sort of combust ideas off each other. And I think that is a challenge that we haven't had that in the last year. People have been in their silos. They may have done company networking drinks and so on over Zoom, but doesn't replace it, and they've not been doing it with other people as much. And so actually I do wonder about how innovative the second half of the decade potentially becomes, because there is a bit of a long tail with these things, and it's just a counterpoint that I wanted to put out there, which
it's a good point, that creative friction, that sort of bumping into someone at the water cooler or whatever.
James, can I just interrupt and answer something that Jimmy said? Because I think it's really important to respond to the point about universal basic income. It is not for people to earn this money, Jimmy, and stay at home. This is a top-up for those in work that aren't earning enough from the jobs that they're doing. So in other words, it would end the issue of in-work poverty in the way that they then have to go to social security to get a top-up in one inefficient form or another, and a bureaucratization which is unnecessary. So I totally agree with you about why we need to be out there as human beings doing stuff. And interacting in the environment that we're in, and it does all these other positive things. So I think those things, I totally agree with you, and I think universal basic income, I think, is just necessary to smooth out the impact on levels of employment and unemployment in different parts of the country, given the changes in technology, which is losing jobs in one area regionally, losing jobs occupationally, and whilst people are shifting from one area to another or an occupation to another, they fall between the cracks. And that is where we have a serious societal issue. And universal basic income is one way of dealing with that. There may well be others that we need to talk about, but this is a conversation we should be having in an era where technological change, to your point, James, and to your point, Jimmy, this isn't slowing down, it's actually speeding up. And quantum computers will speed it up even further over the next few years. So we can't get away from this debate.
Yeah, and to follow on from that, Trevor, I mean, you talked about areas all around the country. Question from Kate Warswick, the view on levelling up. I mean, I paraphrase, but do you buy it Trevor, first of all, and then what is the overall impact on the economy a few years out?
I mean, that's a great question. I don't buy leveling up. Productivity.
You're tough this morning, Trevor.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't work that way. But there are ways you can do it. Deregulate, decentralize, give decision-making powers back to these areas of the country. Allow them to make decisions about whether they want business rates on companies and their high streets or not. Allow them to decide on how they spend money for schools and for hospitals and for education. This is one of the problems that we have with the UK. It's a centralized, one of the most centralized governments in all of Western Europe. We need to give power back to the people, not to paraphrase. And I think that unfortunately, we need much more cooperation amongst these areas where productivity is low, and they need to be connected with better transport links, and there needs to be money spent on Crossrail on HS2, for example, with much better spent connecting North and South Wales together, and Midlands and the North together. I mean, there's a whole bunch of really productivity increasing things that we can, but that's not the direction we're traveling in, unfortunately.
No. Okay, thanks for now, Trevor. I would say it's a great conversation. We haven't got that long left. If you do have a question for the panel, please ping it through now. Ian, I'll come to you. From Michael Room, back to talking about company debt again. How supportive should HMRC be in relation to aged debt? The can is being kicked down the road. Are they acting responsibly by deferring collection of outstanding Crown debt?
They've probably not got an awful lot of choice, is the fact of the matter. I mean, this is a combination of all people that are owed, banks in particular, but as you say, Crown debt as well, are going to have to take a flexible approach. If people call in those debts when the businesses don't have the funding to repay them, then there's only one outcome. And that outcome isn't one that necessarily the government wants to contemplate, I suspect. So I suspect there'll be a fair amount of pressure on, continuing deferrals. We've already seen it with the VAT COVID, which was due to be paid in March this year, and it's been stretched out over 12 months. I'm sure that will apply to other things as well. Self-employed tax returns, back in June, that was deferred. There wasn't so much of a deferral in the January payments. That was asked for, but there may be some softening of that if people can't pay. So I think we will see, deferrals and a relaxed attitude, but ultimately that can't go on forever. There's a lot of money out there that the government has backed. 80% guarantees on SYBILS loans, for instance. That they are anticipating getting large amounts of that back over the next 5 years.
With your logistics hat on, what's your view to the Freeports announcement? I mean, this is seen as a real honeypot for trade, and I wonder how you think people will use them, and to what degree there's a hinterland around them, and actually it helps the regional economy around Teesside and Solent and so on.
Well, as you said, I mean, it plays to the levelling up agenda, and some of these coastal areas that have suffered. But of course, for every winner of a Freeport, there's a loser of the Freeport that didn't get, the location that didn't get a Freeport. And you only have to look up in the northeast where it was given to Teesside, but not to the Wearside bid, which was Nissan and electric battery production. And how will Nissan react to that? Will they accept it? Will they relocate to the new zone? That would be a pretty expensive choice to make. Or will they move to another Freeport in another country somewhere? So there are challenges there. I think there is. This is not a new concept, but it is something that those areas can exploit. I think what we will see is whether this creates genuine new jobs or it relocates jobs from other areas. If you think about logistics companies who, to pick up on Trevor's point, the decentralization point, this will actually concentrate economic activity of those areas into that Freeport location. So for them, that's great. but will that mean that there is a drain away from other parts of the country to get these tax advantages, which are not permanent? They're all relatively short term, to encourage investment in those areas. The one point I would say though about the Freeports is, I think what we're going to see over the next 10 years is a change in the imports. So, we're outside of the EU. We're going to see, greater activity coming in from the Far East, and businesses importing from those areas, doing something to the product and then exporting it out without duties. And that's the Freeports do give that opportunity. Yeah. And one thing that I'm seeing with lots of logistics companies is that they're not just thinking about products going out and sending them to various places, but how they bring products into the UK. And I think that in that sense, it'll be a very positive development for logistics businesses.
And Ian, I'll stick with you for this one from David Griffiths. Do you expect a fundamental change in that relationship between landlords and tenants, really balance of power as well?
Well, landlords are facing, huge challenges, really. I mean, a lot of them have not been receiving, full rent or any rent in some cases, I suspect, on lots of high street properties. There needs to be a fundamental rethink of what's going on the high street. I know that there were grants and things that were pre-announced in the budget, but there needs to be a strategy of getting people, offline, if you like, i.e., removing that sales mechanic from being online to offline. But anybody who's been into central London in the last 2 or 3 months. It is an absolute wasteland, really. All the shops are closed. It's a very, very eerie experience. Now, that will come back clearly, but there is going to be a huge shift into what people need in terms of property and how they use their property. And we've seen that with clients and businesses that we advise, that there is a change. People will do more work from home. They'll need less physical space at the office, and they'll use that space differently. And you're right, that will cause a huge change for what people use property for and what landlords can charge for it.
Okay, thanks very much. And just finally, Jimmy, I want just very in brief. We've talked about what we had on Wednesday. I mean, Trevor cast a bit of doubt on where the vision was. What do you think comes next, if you like? There's a lot of debt that needs to be washed through the system. We have this tax day. I'm just wondering about the signposts about, how businesses should plan for the next couple of years.
Yeah, well, I do think we'll get a lot more on that tax day in terms of March 23rd. I think that'll be a big moment for it. I know one of the questions that we talked about earlier in the week was, would the Prime Minister and Chancellor be planning for an early election in 2023, which I see.
Do you think they would?
No, I personally don't, but it's interesting, since we had that conversation on Wednesday, James, it's also picked up on Conservative Home, which is a big prominent blog in the Conservative Party, and they've been discussing the prospects as well. I think that's highly unlikely, but it's just interesting how that's beginning to gain traction. And actually, if you were looking at things, if the economy is going to really boom in 2022 and 2023, and actually the predictions are that the economy kind of tails off much more in 2024. Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma. It's something I hadn't even thought about at the start.
Interesting. Well, look, Jimmy, I'm conscious of time. We on the hopes of a boom time. That's probably where we need to leave it, and that's all we have time for, I'm afraid. Look, we hope you found this session really useful. Please do join us for the next webinar in the series on the future of the high street. We're going to consider it before the Chancellor gets around to it. That's on April the 1st. In the meantime, for any questions we didn't have time for, please follow up with Ian and Louise at Quantuma. Thanks to them for some really great answers, and I hope we covered a lot of ground this morning for you. And also thanks to Jimmy and Trevor for their economic and political insight, for taking part, and to all of you for your great questions and for tuning in as well. Do take a look at quantuma.com/fortitude. That's got all the